继续 Braid 时空幻境的周年重制版。这开发者解说现在还在 design， 这应该是 design 的第7期了。这怎么看别第7期了？没准守护先可能在这儿呢。先来把这个 special topics 给它清完，应该直接去右边是吧？右边还有一部分，这里应该看完了。对 ，puzzle clarity 这个也看过了。先看 pit， 从下往上走吧。The pit 这个应该连在一起了。
The Pit is an arcade game from 1982 that was some kind of amalgamation of other games. The goal was to go from your stranded UF to grab weapons, simple gated colorful arrows in its tribute.
Nice tribute 对，看过了。下一个还是 pit，
World 4 is
这个没看过。
time is tied to space. In fact, I think it was t equals x and then t equals y. Which there's no t equals y in the final game.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
But how did you have that idea, or...?
It was this physics initial idea. And so once I realized, okay, there's rewind in this game, it's working well. How do I tie in the other physics ideas? Because there's maybe supposed to be quantum mechanics and relativity and whatever. And
right.
Well, what is there about relativity? Like, there's 4 dimensions, right? And like time is a dimension. Can I put that in this game somehow? And does that involve rewind in some way?
I see.
And, you know, regular space-time for us is like 3 + 1 before you start talking about string theory or whatever. This game is 2 dimensions. So, like, how do I map? Is it 2 + 1? And just somehow it just maps onto the idea of, like, what if I just controlled time by your position, right?
Right.
It's just the idea popped up. You know, what can I say? Like those were the inputs, and in this concrete case, it was not very hard to have the idea. Let's just map it to space because that'll be cool. It's again, I start thinking about what that is before I implement it, and it's like, oh, it'll be kind of neat that you're kind of in control of the motion of the world, and if you stop, everything stops. Like before I try to make puzzles with that, it's got an interesting feel and an interesting kind of interactivity, right? And then I think, how would I implement it? And it's like, well, it's pretty easy to look at, like, where is the player spawn in the very initial implementation, maybe even in the final thing. Your spawn point is just like the leftmost part of the level. Mm-hmm. So there's no question about could I go earlier in time than when I spawned in.
Right.
So you just literally load the level and then you simulate it forward, and then instead of just the rewind key, you have an alternate input that's if you walk left, rewind the rewind buffer by that amount, right? And that's very easy to think of implementation wise, and you could kind of hack it in and like, well, if there's some robustness issues with this or whatever, we'll think about it later, right?
But it can't quite rewind the rewind buffer, can it? Because isn't the way that works in Braid that you can also rewind?
Yes.
So it can't quite rewind the rewind buffer in the way that the rewind buffer normally gets rewound, because it needs to be putting that action also onto the rewind buffer.
So it's a little bit different. It's like
you might look at the rewind buffer and apply it or something?
Yes, okay. It's seek to the time indicated by the leftward travel.
Right.
Round to the nearest frame.
Round to the nearest frame.
Take that state and then forward diff the current state to that. Right. And
这是 coding 是吧？
So it is not trivial, but if your code is not a flaming nightmare, it doesn't take that long.
Yeah.
Especially if you're not worried. I'm sure the rewind buffer was just a flat array at that
flat
time,
array,
or whatever. Each frame is a thing, and then there's probably a data structure for each frame. It wasn't that sophisticated, but I don't care, right? There's not that many objects in this game. It's a proof of concept. It's all good. Yeah.
这个应该会在那个 programming 的地方再讲到。The pit.
What about the things that did work? Like, how did we end up getting to like World 5, for example, or the final world or whatever?
Well, again, starting with these principles of it was a physics game, but now it's a rewind game. Okay, what can we do? Like the physics informs what kind of rewind things we could think about. So, hey, there's this whole quantum mechanics thing. There's, for example, this whole many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so maybe there's a world where you can somehow control what choices get made and they happen differently in different things. And that's where World 5 came from. And starting with that abstract idea, and then there's the question like, okay, how is that concretely implemented within the framework that we have? And it's like, well, it's a game where you rewind. So instead of rewind, just undoing everything that you
就
did,
早期的版本
what if all that stuff just happens again?
Mm-hmm.
But then you also now can do something new. And once you think of that, it's like, well, do you support that n times, or is 2 enough? And I decided to stay with 2.
Okay.
And also there are other questions. So the temptation, if you want the most easily implementable thing,
Mm-hmm.
you would be like, well, we somehow just replay the rewind data that you just rewound, right? We
Mhm.
save that somewhere and we push it back on going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can just also do something new. But I didn't want to do that because if both realities going forward are totally separate and cannot communicate, that's a little bit dry, and it leaves off the ability to do certain kinds of puzzles. So for
Okay.
example, in World 3, we have objects that are immune to rewind, right? You could have that here too. Are there still like 2 of them in 2 separate universes, or is it one? Like, what does
Mhm.
that mean?
Mhm.
That's a question. And then is there a different thing, which is again the same way that things were exempt from being rewound before? Is there things are exempt from being in 2
Many worlds.
universes,
Right.
right? Are they in one always?
Right.
As soon as I thought of that, it's like, okay, then you definitely can't just replay the same thing forward, because by doing things in one universe, you can change the state of the other universe at a given time, because you, like, there's a monster that's in both and you stomped on him in one, and so he dies in the other
And the
one
other,
as well.
right? Yeah. So basically, what you ended up choosing was the one where, okay, we're going to act as if there is a second player who just happens to try to do exactly the same things you did at the exact times you tried them, but then we're going to recompute the physics of what happens to the guy based on the actual positions of all the things according to the world rules. So if you move a platform that only exists once across both realities, then he will just miss it if now it's not there and fall
Right.
down or whatever.
Or if something is there that wasn't there before,
Now he can't run through it or something,
etc.
or lands on one. Yeah.
Yes.
etc.
And then World 6 again came from these physics ideas. It's like, okay, relativity.
Mm-hmm.
You have this time dilation thing.
Mm-hmm.
What if I just, not trying to make it be about speed of light or anything
Mhm.
directly, but let's just put time dilation in and just see how that goes. And I wasn't sure at first if that was going to generate enough interesting situations.
Right.
And it turns out to have, although it is mostly kind of binary, right? It's like, well, I want something to go slow is the way that it gets used.
Right.
But that's actually mostly fine. And there are nuances to some of the levels that make it more like the analog part of it comes into play a little bit more. And so the initial implementation, so if you're thinking about, okay, what would this actually be?
Yeah.
It's like, well, you're dropping a singularity somewhere where things are totally frozen somehow at that point. And then maybe we add a little bit of a fudge factor so that you don't walk into that point and
And
the
then you're
game is
stuck.
over,
Yeah.
right? So one of the problems is with the rate itself. Like
Okay.
going way down towards 0, it's not that fun to try and play. Like requiring that is weird.
Because the player just kind of moves too slow through there, and it's
Yeah, everything. Like
Yeah.
if anything going through there is so slow
Yeah.
that it's not fun to wait for it, or
right. Right.
and to require that in a solution wouldn't be that fun.
Right.
Also, even before implementing this, I knew like, hey, the music and stuff, sounds go backward when you rewind. They should slow down appropriately when you're in this thing. And I already could picture in my mind what that would feel like. Like you
Yeah.
would go into the music and it's like,
Yeah.
right? Now, O.2, which is the current factor that I chose, is about the place at which you can still kind of hear the music,
Okay.
but it's pretty slow.
Okay.
Ah.
Like, if you slow things down much further than that, the sonic energy is like so slow that you don't even hear anything coherent. And you also, it would be one thing if you were, I don't know, holding the ring in your hand constantly the way you hold a key and moving around. Because then you could like find the spot that does what you want, but it's
Right.
not like that. It's like you drop it and it's on, and now you
Yep.
pick it up. And maybe I could have tried more of the other thing, but that seemed bad because you would be walking around in the slow thing 100% of the time. It's like it
Well, based on all the things you're saying, I kind
Yeah.
of have, I think, what I assume the obvious question that anyone would have at this point is,
Why slowing down?
why slowing down? Why not speeding up?
I think I just like the slowing down.
Okay, it just, aesthetically speaking, you like things going in and going.
Yeah, but also there's a reason to bias things in that direction, which is again so it's a puzzle game, most of which you have tuned to be playable at 1.0.
Hmm.
Right.
If things get slower than 1.0, it's playable
对的
right.
mostly. It's just, you know, slower. If things get a lot faster than 1.0, maybe it's not playable anymore.
It's not
Like,
playable.
If you're trying to jump on
Right.
a monster, like if you're jumping on monsters at 0.2, it becomes a really different experience, right?
Yep.
If you're trying to jump on monsters at 5.0, like that's unplayable.
Right.
Now that said, I never explored. That's the reasoning, or some of the reasoning, right? I never actually went and explored that. And sometimes you
Right.
do it and you find that there's something you didn't think of. or
Mm.
Right.
whatever,
Right. But this one worked, so
it was
wasn't
fun. I
necessary.
started doing it and I found it was cool and there was enough to do with it, right?
Right. さあ，这个是 Pito，reversible and impassable foliage 两关为什么放一起？哦，这你确定没看过？
Irreversible would be a dramatic title in most contexts, but it seems especially interesting in a game that is all about reversing things. The name is also an oblique
啊，这看过了。
but it became a reference by brute fact. And it's actually a weird coincidence that the whole theme of the World 2 fiction is learning lessons with the damage being
我觉得没必要过去。
reversible.
关键是看这个了，是吧？这两个是连在一起。啊，这个就是 impassable foliage，是这一块。这一次这边是没有的。
I had to try this many, many times actually before I got the point. It's like all these things are killing me, and
Trying to
to
kill
me, and so I rewind a little bit, so I'm alive again, and I get over there, and darn it, the platform is blocked, and what am I going to do? And you realize you have to get up there, evading the yowling rabbits and trolls without once using rewind. And again, I like this because at first rewind seems like this infinite superpower. You can always undie anytime you want. You can always undo anything. It's like, well, no, not quite. Sometimes rewinding has costs. Sometimes it doesn't return the world to the state you intended. And I really like that.
I'm glad you think so. Some people get really mad. Not like mad, but I have a friend who's also a game designer who was like, I don't like this level because it's the first time rewind can actually cause you to fail the game.
啊，对。
Whereas before it was a way of not failing the game, right?
Well, exactly.
And I was like, well, but that's the point. That's what we're doing is we're touring
feature,
the
not a
phenomenon.
bug.
Yeah, I'm glad you agree with me. Now, do you want to? Okay, so when I first conceived this level, it
Wow.
was just like you're describing. Like there's a gauntlet of threats, and you've got to run that gauntlet in a platformer
这个
way.
team
and if
长
you
得好
mess
猥琐。
up, then like you could maybe get a tiny mess up and still make
Sure.
it, but other than that, you know, you probably have to retry. You
Okay.
could also do the following thing. You just hang out by the entrance. There's more monsters over there, but you don't really need to care about that right now. So you just hang out by the entrance.
这就是我的打
And
法，
then once this
That's true.
platform is over the other one,
Right.
再过去。
then all you have to do is not rewind till they overlap
对的，
in
对
the
的。
wrong way, right?
Right.
So
but
now
you
I
have
can
some,
rewind.
Now you have some wiggle
So
room.
like, it's a little bit hard because
Because the
Yeah.
platform has to be not so far to the left that
yeah,
the monsters
basically.
are falling in, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Impassable
The
foliage.
next level, impassable foliage. This one was one of the harder ones for me, but I think that's because there was an idea I was missing. And again, I think it's kind of good that there are puzzles with hard solutions if you don't quite get the idea, and easy solutions if you do get the idea. You know, so in mathematics, the first proof of a result of a theorem is often kind of ugly and kludgy and has a lot of moving parts. And then we have what we call the proof from the book, which is something Paul Erdős came up with, where that's the proof that now everyone says, this is the elegant, insightful proof. And so I think that's actually a nice element for puzzle games to have. So, of course, this reminds us of the irreversible level from some time ago, where the only way to get up there and delay the vertical block from blocking
对，这两关是
a horizontal block
有关
was
联
to get up there without using rewind. Now we have this new tool,
Reprise.
namely the ring.
Namely the ring.
You know, kind of straightforward. We put the ring underneath the plant to slow it down, but now we have these 3 cacti. So we know what we need to do. We need to get monsters over there so we can jump up onto that platform. And we also are given rewind immune monsters, which makes our job here a little harder, because if we don't get onto that platform quickly enough, then we have to sort of start the process over. But the nice thing here is you have 2 kinds of control over the phase. So yeah, it took me a while to realize that the frequencies are the same. If the frequencies were not the same, then you would have to do something really finely tuned with the ring to like alter, you know, slow down the frequency of this cactus so it matches the frequency of the monster cannon.
Yeah.
And thank you for not putting that in the puzzle. But we can control individual cacti by putting the ring close to them, although, you know, one over R, it does affect the other cacti a little bit too. But we can also use rewind to touch up the overall phase
and that
of all
helps.
3 cacti at once. That helps. I like puzzle games where there is an analog element to them, either to the setting or the solution.
Yeah.
I like World of Goo.
Yeah. I mean, analog can become very messy if you're not careful, which is why you don't see it too often, but it can be an interesting space to explore.
Analog. 那从右边先开始。There and back again. 哦
There and back
So kind of-
design enthusiasm that defocus. I'm not sure which kind of reference this is.
啊，然后下一关是 There and back again. 哦，这个居然是音乐的。
Working from the original stereo mix, the general idea was to make the track more foreboding and suspenseful.
这个英语
The
口音就有
rhythm
点
is
重了。
made to sound more like a beating heart, and the continuous drones are processed with a tremolo effect. To make this possible, the original track was divided into drum and harmonic part using D-Mix Pro. Here's the extracted drum part.
对，这个确实是音乐的部分 ，music 的就是。
And now the harmonic part.
听起来好奇怪。
Dividing the original track into drum and harmonic part didn't come without obvious artifacts, so a lot of post-processing had to be done. Here's how the treated drum parts sound like. And now the harmonic part. While the redesigned version of the track was very moody and fitted the artwork, it had too little content that remained audible when pitched down by the game. Luckily, stems came in, which helped to solve this issue. The 5th and final iteration includes elements from the first version, but the melody is now reintroduced, both because it became possible with the stems available, but also because the cello was an important element when pitching down the music.
这个是什么口音？听起来很奇怪，这感觉没怎么听过这种口音。这印度还是意大利之类的，但又不是纯的那个，对，又不像是纯的印度口音。Lair.
So here's our first layer. And so I have to admit, in standard video games, I hate the boss levels. I would much rather mow down large mobs of small to medium-sized baddies. I just never really enjoyed the whole thing of having to carefully memorize, okay, he's charging up his lightning bolt. I have to
Lightning
dodge
bolt.
this way, and then I have to switch weapons because I can hit him in the left mandible, which is vulnerable for 3 seconds, and it's not really what I enjoy.
他不喜欢
So,
BOSS 战。
The first time I played the game, I got here, I was like, oh, Christ, a boss level. Ugh. But this is almost a parody of boss levels, right? First of all, you can rewind, and so you can undie. That's nice. So, if he hits you, whatever.
Whatever.
But, of course, there's this other nice thing going on, which gets back to what I said before about the magic immune key is the one that I can't get back. He looks magical and powerful and scary. He's sparkly. He has the green and gold glow. But I'm not stuck in here with him. He is stuck in here with me. Precisely because he's immune to rewind, I can go back and bonk him again and again and again, and he does not get healed. In fact, it's fun to even, if you time it right, drop the chandelier on him multiple
对，
times
这
in
可以
the
做了。
same fall and just go
打得好的话
down,
是
up,
2
down,
次，
up,
非
down,
常好的
get
话
a
一次就
couple
能搞
hits
定
off him.
5连。
So, okay, he's designed to be scary. He makes noise. He jumps around. The world shakes at his footfall. But actually, once you know what's going on, you're in total control. His sparkliness turns out to make him less powerful than you are.
Less powerful than you are。对，这个确实是这样。看过了吗？这个可能看过。这个 layer 肯定是看过。
So then there's this fun lair puzzle. So, again, kind of like there's this fun lair
2分
puzzle.
46
So, again, kind of like there's a hunt in a bunch of worlds, there's a lair in a bunch of worlds, and it's kind of the same and it's kind of different. Now we have to use this mechanic of sending our shadow to knock down the chandelier, or at least that helps a lot, because this guy is not rewind immune. On the other hand, because he lives in both universes, both I and my shadow can bonk him. There's a lot of sending the shadow to bring down the chandelier, and lo and behold, we get another hit off the guy. I tried to lure the boss over to the side so that he would be under the shadow
这好像听过。
chandelier. I never quite got that right. And then I also tried to get both chandeliers to fall on him. Anyway, I didn't end up achieving any double taps. I just sent my shadow in 5 times, and
Yeah. Well, that works.
every once in a while I undid a tap by going back because I got fireballed and whatever. And then the other nice thing about this puzzle is we see this really stretched journey that we
这
Yeah,
绝
that
对
was,
看过。
you kind of need
you first point where we
those things where, because there's no constraint really pushing it the other way about picking it. You can be pretty relaxed about where in the middle you decide to do this from.
Right. It's interesting. So in some of these puzzles,
Yes.
the design had a very narrow window.
Yes.
In a couple of them, the execution for the player is
Twitchy。
Is that like twitchy runtime and twitchy compile time or
I
something?
don't know.
Twitchy coding
I
time?
certainly didn't think about that at the time.
Yeah.
Hunt 啊，这绝对看过。
So the first world is like what games
上古
people
时期的关卡。
Black, of course, the thing that's on the screen. And so this puzzle is harder for some people than I had expected because of that element, right? And that's why it's interesting being a game designer sometimes.
这个叛逆好小哎。
hunt in this world. This is when, of course, they and bunk that strongest come do that in order.
Yeah, X coordinate.
Is killing me.
Right.
Yeah. Level with them all alive.
I get you.
Get you。他刚最后说吗？追魂那个稍微没什么意思。
We're leaving the level.
Okay,
I just felt that was
let's
the
do
polite.
that.
I
Let's-
just-
Oh,
that
让所有的
was the
复活是吧？
polite thing to do,
Ah.
you know?
Yeah, they're your buddies, right?
Yeah,
they helped you
they-
get where you are today. You
Exactly.
should acknowledge them.
And it's true, they
Acknowledge
look a
them.
little grumpy, but who doesn't, And so I just
Ah.
wanted to leave this level with them all alive.
I get you.
Get you。Face。
I mean, this is so awesome because now we're coupling like time and space. So now we're really starting to use the rewind to control the relative position of these clouds,
这个有看过吗？
which, and change them from something we can't jump over to something we can. And that's really interesting, and it's really fun to play with the fact that half the clouds rewind, the other half don't. And of course, this gets deeper farther on in the game.
Of course, that, again, we start out designing one of these worlds, and the question is, again, what can you do? And I was in the mindset of what's the most minimal thing that I can do given this feature, technical or gameplay feature, that some things don't rewind, right? In the very original prototype of the game, it wasn't quite like this. It wasn't a property of objects. It was just like, there was just the magic key,
就不是 pit，
right? And the magic key wouldn't rewind, right?
Right.
And then
Why not other things?
yeah, well, I realized later, like the way we do the magic key is by excluding it from the rewind loop. So like, let's just have that be a property that could or might not be attached to any particular thing, right? So I was thinking, what's the most minimal thing you can do, and came up with this, and I like it, right? As always, when trying to balance, platformer with puzzle, it's a little bit harder than I wish it was in some ways, in the following way. So I said before, sometimes people miss jumps and they don't realize yet that they can rewind because they're not used to a game that has rewind, right? By the time people get here, probably they have used rewind a bunch and they remember it more. And the problem here is that you very carefully set this thing up, right? And by now, people might be rewinding. And when they rewind, they mess up. And if they rewind to a point when they were over one of the non-rewindable clouds, they'll fall earlier. It's like it becomes a little more frustrating even than it should be, right? So, of course, the right thing to do is be patient and line them up again. But if you do that too soon, you'll fly back up into the air, right? So you want to stand on the ground for a little bit, right? Hold on, rewind the right amount, get them in phase, and then not miss the jump, right? And of course, you can do things that are messier than that. That's like a very deliberate way to solve it. You can do things that are messier, but they're more frustrating, right? So,
But I also like this element of it, because now that there are objects in the world that don't rewind, it means that it might be a little tricky to recover the state you wanted. It means that, rewind is not just an undo. It's going to change some aspects of the world and not change others, and it's going to be a little complicated. And you start to sense that rewind is going to be this very dynamic element in your strategy.
这个应该看过了。
So World 6 doesn't have the most changes as far as like scenery or new additions, but it has one of the biggest pervasive changes, which is the color palette. And I was never really happy with the color palette in the old game. It's sort of red and blue and a kind of desaturated gray that kind of reads as yellow. And then in the foreground you have the grass from World 3, which just kind of feels like it's from a completely different palette and it doesn't hang together. This was an opportunity to right the old wrongs, and I feel that the pinkish purple background with a lot of orange as well and some blue is a lot more harmonious, and the grass brought closer to teal with more blue present. It's just hanging together a lot more. I mean, to me this has a kind of like sumptuousness or something, like the pink is kind of erotic or something, but then like also kind of this flame feeling and this distant feeling that's still there. It's like a...
I mean, you say enticing, maybe erotic. Is there maybe like another way of putting that? Maybe seductive, right? Because we're in the thick of it at this point, right? It doesn't get more dangerous than this.
Yeah, that's probably a better word, seductive. But it's like it's a city, right? So maybe it would be some kind of like lounge with like low lights and kind of like a slinky atmosphere or something like that.
还有这样的设计，好，没了。这样这个应该算结束了。下一个这个大篇章开始，我觉得可以反过来，先走最里面，否则每一次都要从最外面走到最里面，就かなり遠いので，かなり遠くてやばいな。这样 Special Link Topics 结束了，長すぎや。那这里也一样，不如先从右边开始。Brian Moriarty。 啊，这个是 Conversation with Brian Moriarty。跳这么高啊！你要靠这个来登上去。这是我从右边先开始啊，这倒不是很多，他的对话倒不是很多。Keeping the game from breaking your concentration. From breaking your concentration. Breaking your concentration 就不让你集中了。 Three easy pieces 啊，这东西还不太一样。
One of the worst. Oh, I played a game recently that did this. I don't even remember exactly which one it was.
Celeste，
I rage quit the game
Rage
because
quit.
it was a puzzle game, platformer.
你不会真的是
And-
Celeste 吗？
I was sitting there trying to solve a
这可能
puzzle.
就是
and-
Celeste。
Okay, one thing that platformers classically do is that the mascot or whoever has an idle animation, right? After you stand there for a
哦，
while.
就原地
It's a
不动
way
是
of
吧？
just having the game respond to you a little bit, making the character feel more alive.
Right，
So typically, if you don't move for some amount of time, we play this animation. How long is that time? Your choice on that as a designer kind of determines what attention span you think your player has.
嗯
Well, okay, and the size of the animation, which we'll get to in a second. But like, if you think people are fine sitting there for a minute, typically 2 minutes, and then the guy does some idle just to provide atmosphere and a little bit of character, that's one choice.
嗯哼，
Or maybe you're like, oh man, I really want people to see this idle animation. It's cool. Let's fire it off after 15 seconds so people see it a lot, right? That's a different choice about what your expectations are of the audience. Now, suppose you have
Now.
an idle animation that fires after some amount of time that is approximately the amount of time that it takes to take in all the elements and start thinking about the
哦哦哦
and then
哦，懂他意
also
思，
suppose
懂他意
you
思。
have one of these like chiptune aesthetics and you attach a really obnoxious sound effect to the
懂了，懂了，
idle
懂了。
animation.
然后你就被
So
干扰
that
出去。
every time I start dropping in and thinking about the puzzle,
分心
right
了。
then it's like, "Er," like whatever noise it is, and the dude's like looking at you like, what? You know, often these mascot animations are obnoxious. They're like shrugging or like, I don't know what to do or whatever. right?
嘲讽是吧？
Like famously, this isn't really a platformer, but famously like
是吗？
the idle animation in MDK. Do you remember that
什
game?
么是 MDK？ No，
Okay. Well, it's like an over-the-shoulder like kind of shooter game or whatever.
没
But
听过。
it's over the shoulder. You're seeing your character from the back, and the idle animation is like the guy looks and turns around and like whatever, because that was the way that you could see the front of the guy's face. Except you couldn't see his face because the idea of the game is he's got like some sniper helmet with like a big Pinocchio nose where the bullets come out. I don't know. It is a weird game.
Okay.
Anyway, I didn't. So that particular game I was just complaining about
It's new。
is new. That didn't happen back in the Braid days, but I had that idea that I didn't want to do that stuff. We didn't compose new songs for the new edition because I don't think it's necessary and because it's also too big of a change. I don't want to change what the game is, but we did. It's more like we invested more into a richer soundscape. Now, the actual sound effects in the original game were literally, I bought them for 99 cents on soundrangers.com and did maybe a very small amount of audio editing. They were very utilitarian. They were relatively sparse. There weren't ambient sounds of any kind, so I was relying on the music to provide ambience, whereas you can often have both. And I just wasn't thinking that much about sound besides, I mean, I was thinking a lot about it in a certain way. You know, like I said, the jump sound is very minor, and I don't want sounds that don't indicate significant changes in gameplay state and that kind of a thing. But in terms of like actual quality within one sound effect, for example, like how good of an effect is it and stuff, I think I didn't have the bandwidth to think about that. And so the sound effects in the original game are not very good. I just have to say that bluntly. It's fine
Are
because
they
they're good
updated
enough.
now?
They are updated and they're
Ah,
much
这样。
better. Now, they're better than they would be. So for a while they were purely, 99-cent sound effects. And then at two different times during development, when audio guys came on and worked on it, again, I'm talking about the original game, my instructions were just take what I was doing and make it a little better. Because the problem I had, again, with multiple people, so maybe I got unlucky, or maybe this was just the times, and this was mostly by email, right? I was like, hey, I would describe in a couple paragraphs what I want, and then regardless, everything that I got back sounded to me like a sound effect from a casual game, right? Like a gem matching game or
Gem matching game.
Farmville or something. And that was wrong for this.
Twinkly.
Yeah, lots of like reverb and just like
Overprocessed.
made for people with short attention spans, it seemed like, as well, right? And maybe that's what, since these games were big at the time, there were a lot of them, and so if you're an audio freelancer, maybe that's what most of the people who try to contract your services
That's
want.
what they want, yeah. And they assume that's what you wanted.
Yeah, and after some back and forth, when I'm saying no, I don't really want it to sound like a casual game, I couldn't get that, and so what I said was, here's my original sound effect. Just make it a little better, and we'll go with that. And so that's what we did. And so, I mean, when I say the sound effects are not very good, I mean in a certain dimension of sonic interest internal to the sound effect. How much information is there in the sound?
Did you do any variations?
A little bit, yeah, but
During
not as many
gameplay?
as you would if you had a dedicated audio person on the game.
Or like nothing, like what you did in The Witness, for instance.
Like, I think there might have been 2 jump variations or something, you know.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays the new machines are capable of creating in real time all incredible variety of variety.
Well, and also the audio team on the new game did a similar thing. They had more license to bring more creativity to it and revamp the sound effects, and they're all high quality.
Plus, you
now.
had an audio team.
Yeah, and that matters.
Have that before.
啊，这是一起的什么 ？The original sound effects were very cheap. Were very cheap. 啊，然后这就在楼上，这里那也是。这个 Moriarty 不就是本人吗？啊，下去看一下。麻烦了下来。啊，这里果然挺大的，这不会能砸的吧？这有什么用啊？啊，这个灯很早期也给你提示了是吧？哎，刚刚有什么 chandelier and what 没带的看一下 ？Cracks in chandeliers and entropy entropy 真的假的 ？An additional note from Jean about chandeliers 这应该从哪个顺序来看 ？The history of boss monsters. Why the boss conspicuously wear the key? Lair 2个。
So then with the monster was programmer art, and in fact, the name, if you go in the code, the name of that monster is Gun Boss.
Gun Boss.
And the reason he's Gun Boss is because early on, when you're just making a game and you don't know what it is yet, you get excited about I get excited about wacky ideas like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if this game like had a big dude with a gun in it?
No, gun.
Right. And then I started thinking about that, and I kind of didn't want to program a big complex guy. I mean, he was in the game for a while, again, similarly as like he's a texture that moves around, and you drop the things on him, and he runs out of hit points and dies with the HUD squares.
Yeah.
That was all playable for a long time. And then I think while he was still programmer art, I got the idea to put the horns on him.
I'm trying to understand the concept here.
So the point is he has 5 hit points.
And there are 5 horns.
Yeah, and every time you knock him with a chandelier, one of the horns flies off, and when he runs out of horns, he dies.
That's great. Hey,
Yeah.
that's simple.
Now, I also kept
I never
the
noticed
HUD.
that, but it's cool.
Yeah. Well, I also kept the HUD, which is maybe why you don't notice it, because you don't need that
Right.
to
it's,
figure it
I mean,
out.
the HUD's almost, either the HUD or the horns almost.
They're redundant.
Yeah, redundant.
And the reason I kept the HUD, like, when I originally did the horns, I was like, we'll probably get rid of the HUD. And then I
People
didn't
might
want
not notice the horn. Well, I didn't notice
yeah,
the horns.
well, exactly.
Right?
But you might have noticed the horns if the HUD wasn't there.
Right.
But it was just one of those things where I was like,
No, it makes
also,
sense.
the initial spirit of the game, like, I thought it was funny to have a HUD like that. That's like, this is happening now. And I just kept that. It was like a flavor note that happens once in a while that I just kept.
It's a nice way of putting it.
This is obviously 2 redundant elements. So you should either have one or the other. And in fact, if I were being stern about game design, I would normally say that.
Redundancy is not necessarily wrong.
It is if you want.
It could be a reinforcing thing.
It can. Anyway, so I put the horns on him, but he basically was okay. So originally, like in my imagination, before I ever built the dude, he was like probably some dude standing around, and he would like aim his gun around, and the gun was probably like a big thing. And then I'm like, I don't want to program that right now because I have more important things to do. But also, you know, if you're trying to hit him with chandeliers and stuff, you kind of want him to be close to a sphere or a circle. And the reason behind that was because the collision code, right? So these monsters, for example, if you sort of think about what's the circle that roughly approximates their shape, that's what the collision code is testing.
Collision
against.
code.
And so you want the visuals to be as close to
表
that as
情还有这么
possible,
多。
otherwise it feels weird. Like, oh, I'm hitting him when I shouldn't. I'm not hitting him when I should, right? And so then I thought, okay, maybe this guy
哦，
is
这
just
可以2连。
a bigger version of one of these littler monsters. He's like got big and fat from living in his throne room or something. And
Or he's the boss.
well, he's the boss, yeah. And then instead of having this gun that spins around, I also thought about like, okay, where do the bullets come out if you have this gun that's changing angle, and can players deal with that? And do you have weird scenarios where if you're inside the radius of wherever the barrel edge bitmap is, that you don't get hit by the things, and then if you're outside,
yeah,
you
right.
do? I didn't really want any of that, so I'm just like, you know what? He's gonna just shoot shots out of his mouth.
啊，就把枪拿掉了。
So it was this process of simplifying the guy. Now the specific look, I think, was developed in large part by David, because the thing that I drew certainly didn't have many appealing properties. But we talked over some stuff, like how do the horns work? In the original one, it's just like horns stuck on this guy. I mean, what are they? Do the horns go into his head, or are they on the helmet? And like, there's weird consequences of thinking about that either way. You know, he's wearing armor as an indicator that, you know, he's tough, and it makes the character of the, well, you may think about who else in the game is wearing armor.
I was going to bring him up later.
Yes.
Others have noticed the distinct resemblance between this creature and the knight who appears in the final level.
Yeah. And so, you know, we had these discussions and balanced these factors, and came up with the design.
Which, considering the atomic bomb interpretation of this thing, is a rather interesting thing to do. What does that imply? Yeah, but what does that imply, John? I mean, the princess is running into the arms of what?
You know, game is what it is, man.
Yeah,
so
okay. That's a non-answer. So that's okay. It's like, you don't have to. Some of these things don't have answers. It's something the listeners have to appreciate.
They're not. You know, there aren't answers
not
that I'm going to
answers.
verbalize.
Oh. So you actually have something in mind there. It's not.
What I would say is, the specific question that you just said is not exactly the way that I think about it.
Okay. Here he's doing his famous KG act, people.
KG act. 走。
But yeah, there's other functional things that the boss had to do
Right.
as well that helped determine the look. So initially, I think with the programmer art version, you know, it's just this guy, you drop the chandeliers on him, he dies, and then the key pops out. That's bad game design, because, like, if there's something you need to do to proceed forward in the game, which you do here, because the door's locked, you can't get out of this level. Most of the game you can walk through, right? But these levels, you cannot exit them by walking on the right unless you beat the boss. So there are the few choke points in the game, which is part of what makes them dramatic as well. Like, if you could just walk past this boss, he's kind of lame. But so if you need something to proceed, and the game gives it to you arbitrarily in response to something you did not expect, then you're not really proceeding intentionally through the game. That's, like, broadly speaking, a not very good thing for a game to do.
Right. Yeah, Ron Gilbert makes this observation in his criticism of adventure game designs.
Yeah.
Finding the answers before the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it was definitely a thing that I wanted to do, to make the key visible. And then how is it visible? Is he like holding it? that might imply that you can go grab it from him, because you can do that with the smaller monsters, right? And so it's actually like locked via some clasp onto his armor until he gets knocked out. These were all things that we went back, like relatively small details that nobody would notice were big parts of the conversation.
That's where the difference between something fine and something ordinary happens. Is in those little details.
Yeah, but the problem is there's always things afterward that you look back and you're like, yeah, I should have thought of that
Why
one.
didn't I think? Oh, lost opportunities. It's
Yeah.
All my games, Loom in particular. Oh God, so many missed opportunities there that were low cost tweaks I could have made that just would have like amped it up. I mean, you see it all too late.
Yeah.
Because when you're in the middle of, I'm working 80-hour weeks for months.
Yeah.
You're not always at your best when you're.
Oh, totally. Like there's an expansive mode of mind that is conducive to that kind of noticing.
Yes.
And you don't get to do that when you're grinding through to-do lists all the time.
You do not.
It's a very different mode of operation. Now, I have a little bit of an advantage relative to what you're talking about with Loom, because like my games just take so long. Like calendar time solves problems.
Yeah, well, it gives you more chances to see these things.
It gives you chances to like wake up in the morning and go, oh yeah, I know.
Or have the shower moment, right?
Yeah. But I found that those, if I'm too snowed under by to-do lists, those don't happen very often. But they happen much more often when I'm not.
Right.
But nevertheless.
No, I could have made. I mean, Braid took 2.5 years.
3.5.
3.5
total.
Okay,
3.5 years.
It's like 2 looms at least,
two,
right?
2 or 3 looms, yeah.
Yeah.
3年半，这就夸张了。The history of the boss monster conspicuously wear the key. 先看这个。An additional note from John about chandeliers. Lair. Shit.
We discussed a case where David came up with the details of how to handle chandelier breaking visually. And these details involved some thematic elements.
Thematic
I hadn't
element.
planned those out ahead of time, and I accepted what he did. This might sound like I'm not very deliberate about what goes in the game, but actually it's a good way to illustrate how my job as game director actually works with regard to disciplines that I don't do the hour-to-hour work of myself, such as graphics and sound. Games can be big and complicated. I found that in general, I can't myself have enough ideas to fill out the whole game, because when you want high-quality work containing painted art or sound or whatever, well, part of something being high quality is that it has ideas in it. And because I'm not a practitioner of these sub-disciplines, it is hard for me to have these ideas a priori. And if I did have all the ideas, that might be stifling for the people doing the work, because they would have no way to bring creativity to bear. And if there's no creativity involved, you might have a hard time finding good people to do the work. As the games I do have gotten bigger, this has become increasingly true, that I can't have all the ideas myself. So what I do as director is to filter the ideas. My job is to have a very strong image of what the game is trying to be in terms of mood and overall feel. And when ideas are compatible with this, they go in. And if they're incompatible, well, we have a conversation about how to revise the work to better fit the overall picture. In this role, my job is to check ideas, and sometimes, maybe frequently, to say no. And I've learned that it's very important for me to say no when things are not quite right, otherwise the game can suffer. In the case of the chandelier, everything went very quickly because the work that was done cooperated with the overall picture of the game and helped support its major themes. So I could just integrate David's work directly without revision. Sometimes things don't go so well.
World 3
and it's
redo.
best to catch those early before people do too much wasted work. Because if things go far without being checked, and then you decide, hey, we have to redo large amounts of stuff, people can become pretty unhappy.
Right. That's true. 啊，这个是 World 3 redo 啊，就这个 Darker World 3，这个看过的 Dark World 3，
I wanted to create a sense of like
这好像没
encroaching.
听过，这个我记得是看过的。
David mentioned doing this
Okay.
to connect the
Darker
back then both
version.
looking
Super Meat Boy.
to uncomfortable and may cause drama. it's much safer just to avoid the conflict and just roll ahead with the game that you have. But when it's the right thing for the game, you really should do it.
You really should do it.
I wanted to create a sense of like encroaching unease by starting with this forest that looks very lush and beautiful, but as it progresses would become oppressive in some way. So there are plants that are kind of increasingly fanciful and strange that become more and more dense as you go along. So that was the intention. After I finished work on World 2, we went right into World 3, and we hadn't really plotted out that trajectory through all the worlds, so the pacing wasn't as clear. So the first thing I did was actually much too abruptly jumping into something very dangerous and very ominous. It was a nighttime forest. So we had an abrupt transition to like a dark palette, blues and everything. I actually did quite a bit of painting for all that before John said, pause, this is just a lot
way too dark.
Way too dark. We need to like just take a small step towards danger here. So at that point, actually, we hadn't yet done like an overview of all the game worlds. So at that point, I said, look, we need to like plot this all out a little more. So there was some overview work I did on everything to ensure that each world would progress at the right pace towards this sort of sense of danger in human structures, and also that they would be differentiated in palette and all that stuff.
I like that it was, this is too dark. We need to step it back a little bit, and then you just went full, like, beautiful golden sunshine.
Yeah, well...
It's almost like, you know, even further back than World 2, in some way.
That's right. I mean, the sense of danger may kind of advance a little more later, like you go underground, or, like I said, the plants become a bit oppressive. At least that's the intention. I'm not sure. You tell me how well that came across. But, yeah, the danger is not, like, the main concept or anything here. It's really the idea of magic and kind of breaking the regular laws of the world, opening a door to something unknown, maybe dangerous.
Maybe dangerous. Darker World 3 World 3 Redo 啊 World 3 Redo 就这儿是吧？这两个连在一起，这个 back 不 back 也没什么意义了。然后 back 就到 pit， 怎么会到 pit 呢？这不回不去了吗？搞笑呢。回到这儿了。这个是 World 3 Redo 的，对。照理是应该回到这儿。Darker World， 这很容易出 bug， 点来点去，相当容易出 bug。对了，看出 bug， 回不来了。Lair。
My first inkling
好长。
of why you had sent me this Braid game was when I was playing and came upon the level that has a level with a large, suspiciously oriental-looking monster occupying a chamber with 2 chandeliers. But then yesterday you told me that this puzzle with its 2 chandeliers and the monster was actually in the game very, very early.
It was, yeah.
Long before you had explicitly put in the A-bomb references.
Yeah, it was something like, it was one of the early prototypes. Something like...
Can't remind me.
You know, in the first couple weeks of
So that's creepy.
Maybe. I mean,
That's
it depends. It depends on how accurate you believe your interpretation is, and or
I think
what your model of causality.
I'm not the only
is.
person to have seen the parallel here.
I mean, yeah, it depends. How do you think the universe works?
Oh, so no, are we asking how that thing could happen? Oh, how far do we want to go into this, John?
Well, I would like to.
I mean, this
I would like to.
You want to talk about causality?
I would like to stick with specifics of the game.
Okay, somebody pointed out, I had not noticed it, the images embedded into the chandeliers.
Mm-hmm.
It has a figure, a woman looking at 2 men on either side of her, kind of in a repose, very similar to the Andromeda pose in some ways.
Oh.
Well, one thing it does is when the chandeliers break, there is a clear separation between the man and one of the men and the woman and the man. There's a breakup. there's literally a breakup there. So you're using your personal relationship metaphor is brought in even here. Yeah. Right. So that's cool. I don't know when you. I mean, so was that? Who put that in? Did you tell the artist put that in?
I feel like David did that without prompting from me, but you also have to remember he was working on the game for a long time and knows what it's about.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's one of those things where he did that, and I was like, yeah, that's good, maybe. But again, I don't promise.
So I understand this. You have 20,000 decisions to make a day, and you don't going to remember the whole chain.
Yeah. I actually could probably, a lot of this correspondence was email, because he was working remote for the majority of this, but we did meet once in a while in San Francisco and work, so like it's quite possible that this discussion happened in person too.
But I just wanted to point out to the listeners who may not have caught what I said there. You claimed that the A-Bomb stuff was a late edition, yet this was an early edition, and to me, at least, the parallel here, the visual reference is pretty easy to see. I mean, did you know subliminally or unconsciously that this was, or what do you think? How would you account for that?
I mean, I will not.
It could be pure coincidence.
I will not attempt to say anything about this specific thing, right? But broadly speaking, when I make games,
it may have been on your mind, and
Okay, in the same way that, if you're a player of a game, in the same way that your subconscious mind, whatever that is, helps you solve puzzles, however it does. Well, when you're making a game, you're basically trying to solve a very huge, very difficult puzzle, right? And fortunately, it's a puzzle with multiple solutions, but some of the solutions are a lot better than other ones. And in any case, it's very hard to solve because of all the pieces and how they connect together and the ramifications of moving one thing on the other things. So because it's a big, difficult puzzle, we should not be surprised that you wake up in the morning sometimes and know the answer to something, or maybe you used to think something was the right decision, and then one day you realize, I haven't really thought about this in a while, but I'm pretty sure that's the wrong thing to do now, and I should instead do this other thing, right? That happens with me a lot, right? And there's two opposite ends of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum there's a very well-defined situation. Like I have a certain scene in the game, and it's got these chandeliers in it or something, and whatever. I need to figure out how many hit points the boss should have. What's the right answer there? It's a very specific, well-honed-in scenario. So sometimes you think through that rationally, like, if he has 93 hit points, that seems very tedious, right? And if he has one, I can't do the game mechanics, right? But in some of those cases that get more complex, intuition, for me, plays a role, for sure. Now, the other end of this spectrum is just deciding what to do when you're in an open-ended situation. It's like, I don't know what goes here at all. Like, I have to figure out what is a good game going to be vis-a-vis this thing. Like, imagine that you have the beginning and the ending of a game, and like, okay, what's the middle?
Right.
That's a really big question.
That's exactly how I design my games.
Yeah.
With the beginning and the ending, and I have to, I guess I need the middle now.
Yeah.
How am I going to get there?
But that's such a big question, right?
Yeah.
And for me, that's when intuition especially comes into play, because the possibilities are so big and so disparate, you can't really think about all of the possibilities.
I call this the dividing infinity problem.
Yeah. And this is something that probably every artist in every medium has to do. Like, how do you decide what to do?
And what not to do.
Yeah.
好多东西我之前都没发现，比如说这个灯上面其实有3个人嘛，其实不止3个人，但头最大的3个人。像这个中间偏有一点点的姿势确实有点像安多美达。然后当这个灯一旦下去了，右边2个人会跟左边那个人分开。 另外一点是这个 BOSS 头上的角是有判定的，而且每造成一次伤害，它那个角会掉到地上，就每次会少一根，每次会少一根。这种设计你不仔细看还真看不到。
Is your just quick technical procedural thing?
Procedural thing.
Is your method that the programmer art and the final art produced by the artist is a drop-in replacement, literally?
Oh no, not at all.
Oh, so it's you had to reprogram.
I had to do a lot of extra programming, and so the game was totally working. For example, without any kind of parallax scrolling in the background, it was 1-to-1.
Right.
And just going from that to the parallax version with all these particle systems and stuff was a bunch of extra programming.
Yeah.
And we sort of did that over time as David did the art.
Yeah, that part I understand, but I mean, you didn't produce placeholder art for the parallax scrolling, right? So it couldn't be a drop-in replacement.
Yeah. Well, even so, with these chandeliers, for example, we were working out the system by which we represent all these graphics in the game. And what I did was, David has like a Photoshop file. He's drawing the things in Photoshop. The way Photoshop works is there's a bunch of layers, right? And you can enable and disable visibility on them and all
I've been
these
using
things.
it since 1990.
Yep. And so we had this exporter. So rather than exporting bitmaps to some other format, right, we have an exporter that looks at the Photoshop file, looks at the layers, right, finds the sort of the bounding box of what pixels are set in that layer, possibly chops it into smaller pieces, both because there was a maximum texture size in those days, right, which is variable based on platform, but we could be like, well, we don't want any pieces to be bigger than 256 pixels wide or something.
这关太难搞了。走了。啊，顶上又看完了 additional note from John about chandeliers。这个呢 ，cracks in the chandeliers and entropy， 还是这关，这没看过吗？这关要想听的东西太复杂了。这个也看过了吧？
Is your just quick technical?
From shop, sort of right, which is variable based on platform, but we could be like, well, we don't want any pieces to be bigger than 256 pixels wide or something.
这个你确定没看过？
We discussed a case actually works with regard to disciplines that I don't there. We discussed a case where David came up with the details of how to handle chandelier breaking visually. And these details involved some thematic elements.
啊，这个
I
看过
hadn't planned those out ahead of time, and I accepted what he did. This might sound like I'm not very deliberate about what goes in the game, but actually it's a good way to illustrate how my job as game director actually works with regard to disciplines that I don't do the hour-to-hour work of myself, such as graphics and sound. Games can be big and complicated. I found that in general, I can't myself have enough ideas to fill out the whole game, because when you want high-quality work containing painted art or sound or whatever, well, part of something being high quality is that it has ideas in it. And because I'm not a practitioner of these sub-disciplines, it is hard for me to have these ideas a priori. And if I did have all the ideas, that might be stifling for the people doing the work, because they would have no way to bring creativity to bear. And if there's no creativity involved, you might have a hard time finding good people to do the work. As the games I do have gotten bigger, this has become increasingly true, that I can't have all the ideas myself. So what I do as director is to filter the ideas. My job, compatible, well, we have a conversation about how to revise the work, and I've learned that cooperate well, and it's best to catch those early before people do too much wasted work. Because if things go far without being checked, and then you decide, hey, we have to redo large amounts of stuff, people can become pretty unhappy. Early prototype was programmer art, and for example, those chandeliers were, in fact, they would just sort of fall on the dude or early in the process. Not get too big about what we're doing. Particular case with the chandeliers, the high, and this or whatever.
Oh, that explains.
啊，这个反而没看。
Early prototype was programmer art, and for example, those chandeliers were like
The square.
gray rectangles with
Square.
yellow
I,
balls
know,
on it.
I do program
yeah.
art. Yeah.
Originally, as we said, they're just gray rectangles, and in fact, they would just sort of fall on the dude or not. It was like the minimum thing that you need to implement. They would like change to a different sprite where the little glowy balls were like crushed or something, right? And that was also because early in the project, I was in a scarcity mindset where I was thinking the probability is that I'm not going to finish this game and I'm going to bail on it or something. So I have to minimize that risk. And like, let's not get too big about what we're doing here and just go forward, right? But as the game went on and got bigger, I was like, well, I would be disappointed if we didn't do this or that. And in this particular case with the chandeliers, one of the things that I wanted to do is have in the game some representation of the idea of entropy going from low to high, and that being a thing that you can rewind and see happen, right? So like breaking the bottle or unbreaking the bottle is like a classic, it's like a classic example in physics or whatever.
That explains the wine glass puzzle piece, doesn't it?
A little bit.
Or that
not complete. It's not completely explanatory, I would say.
But
right?
it's a
connective.
It's a connective thread.
Yeah.
Right. But it's those little touches that make the difference between an ordinary thing and a rich thing.
Yeah. But in this case, I wanted that in the gameplay somewhere. And early on, I'm like, maybe there will just be something as I design the mechanics. But then eventually, I'm like, well, no. I became very clear. We don't actually want there to be a lot of mechanics in this game because it shouldn't have that, right? Not a lot of like basic platformer mechanics, right? But I did have this chandelier opportunity to do that, and it's like, yeah, it's not very flashy. You want to do something cool in the game that embodies this idea, so let me do this thing where the pieces break off. And I'm pretty sure I remember doing the programmer art version of all the pieces, which was especially weird and bad. But then when David came along and did the art for the chandeliers, we did that.
かなり長
My
い。
first inkling of
あ、ちょっと
on game. How could it happen?
長すぎやろ。
Working remote
さすがに
is a big thing.
有点疲劳了
And it，
尤其
builds
这
this
种
thing. Like imagine
这种边听还需要边躲怪的关，有些人你直接放置 play 嘛就放置 play 了。总有 BOSS 的关，讲道理放一个那东西其实不太好处理的。这应该已经 design 第7期了，还有那么多，还是有点可怕的。啊，对，这个是 conversation with Brian Moriarty， 底下是没有的，底下是没有。对，这个已经算相对不算长了，这一个，这个算 music 是吧？啊，这个算 music 的，这个多长？这听一下。
These are excerpts from an interview by Brian Moriarty, the designer of classic adventure games Loom and Trinity,
Loom and
among
Trinity.
others. Trinity was an especially formative game for me. As a teenager, I had played and enjoyed almost all of the Infocom text adventures on home computers. These were my favorite kind of game at the time, and Trinity, I felt, was by far the best of them. It put an impression into my mind of what a game could be like that was very refined and deliberate in its artistic sensibilities. Many years later, when I went to make Braid, Trinity served as a guiding image of what I was trying to achieve, though it had to do this in a very vague, misty way, as the two games are very different in form.
我还以为这个 Brian Moriarty 是他们当时开发小组中的成员，搞了半天是其他游戏的制作者。所以一直在巴拉巴拉巴拉说话的，应该就是这个游戏的 main director 或者 main producer。行吧，下一期从这个 Brian Moriarty 开始。我操，这个审美疲劳还是有一点的，还是就大概吃了啥了呢？嘛，稍微搞一下 face， 这25秒才能破吗？37秒78，我觉得稍微慢了点，就当这个 brain fresh， 稍微来洗一下脑子。否则看到你吃烂了嘞。那后面我相信越到后面重复度应该越高，经常会有前面已经打完的关卡些能直接可以撤的。听过的东西后面会越来越多，但很乱，并且这个话痨是真的有点话痨。因为そもそも这个游戏的流程是そこまで長くないからね，对吧？有一说一吧，这个游戏的流程是没有那么长的。 流程并没有很长，但是他居然能搞这么多的这个解说，还是有点夸张。反正都会被这朵花给挡住了。实际上来啊，这还更慢了。啊，58啊，这个是之前的那个 best， 不是早晚都会被那朵花挡住，有什么区别吗？这关58我觉得已经可以了。哎呦，好。稍微来玩点不一样的东西。这张一打完起码10多期，然后后面不知道还有多长，后面应该是不会太长了。因为有些东西其实现在就已经算是出现过了。啊，这个就很烦人。这怎么做到58秒？就这样，这感觉破不了。嗯。嚯，这关的时间真能紧，看来另外一个就要换思路了。这个居然超了！ 啊，我觉得能把那记录稍微往前刷一点就可以了，把刚刚那两关就算降了。哇，这居然没破，这个居然没破，破了吗？没破吧？听到那声了，差了一点点，就把那东西破掉就完了。哎，这过头了。我操！要老死，这个也太夸张了，操！就这样吧。5824853767，这太夸张，太夸张了。这应该已经65个啊，对，是有追加的，有道理。看一下当时的这个 speed running 呢，哦，这个都有58秒42，那是有点可以。37秒67啊，这么夸张？37秒67，58秒42。啊，58秒42是吧？58秒42，37秒67，这居然平了吗？24秒85不太一样的。还能平的，妈呀，这个就不多看了。OK， 行了，这 commentary 还需要打10年了，这个确实有点冗长了，全部能坚持下来听完的，我觉得也是奇才。就设计这个游戏的开发者是开发者当中的奇才，你能把这个10几个小时，你真的要打的话，就得花20个小时，我估计20期应该是要的。现在你第7期了，看着吧，你中间还需要有些 speed run 夹杂之类的。行了。